one of the more exciting topics, at least in my opinion, when thinking about and when working through a multifamily transaction, and that is the LOI and the PSA process. So this is when kind of the deals start becoming real. You start to get those kind of deal jitters, deal butterflies, where you're thinking that maybe this deal, out of the hundreds that you need to look at to close one deal, this might be the one, and it's a really exciting couple steps in the process. But it's also extremely important steps in the process, and it's really where you're able to kind of set yourself apart as far as a buyer. If you are ready to go, if you have all your steps in place, and you're not kind of flying by the seat of your pants, it's really important to have a defined process and steps in that process in the LOI and PSA process, to make sure that you are showing as a experienced buyer, what the steps are, how to coordinate with the brokers, with the seller, with all your third party people in the transaction, and just make sure it's a good start to the transaction. We like to set expectations up front that, look, we are closers. We come in and we're aggressive and early on getting on site for due diligence, making sure our lenders are being lined up. So just going through all those steps in the process to make sure that you're not going to delay closing, and also not only that side of things, but also that you're not missing anything, and you're actually doing a full job of due diligence, and you're not missing anything, you're not making any mistakes, and you're being a good steward of investor capital when you're looking at these deals, and making sure that you're finding everything that you need to be finding. So just really important step in the process. And I want to make this conversational. So if there's questions that come up as I'm talking through this, feel free to put them in the chat or the Q&A box. I'll be checking both, and we'll try to get all those questions answered for you as well. Brief background on myself. My name is Fitzgerald. I'm the Director of Acquisitions at PassiveInvesting.com. I've been here almost 3 years now, which is crazy to think about. Like I said in the beginning, I'm from Pennsylvania, live in Charlotte, North Carolina. Been fortunate to have done about $1.3 billion worth of transactions, and have built out an incredible team on my acquisitions team within the company. I've done a 12-unit in Charlotte on my own as far as a personal investment, as well as invested in multiple kind of larger scale syndications with our group. So yeah, happy to be here, and hopefully we can add some value today. So what I'm going to do is just kind of go through our steps in our process as far as what actually happens, when you send an LOI. How does that process work? Are there negotiations that take place during that process? How do you come up to a signed LOI? What happens after you get a signed LOI? What are kind of the steps in that process? And then when the first draft of PSA is sent, how do those negotiations typically go? Maybe we can talk about some sticking points that we've seen historically come up more often than others, and just kind of go through that whole process. So again, happy to have you all here. So in the LOI process, it's important for us, at least, we're not necessarily touring every deal that we're putting an offer on. So I know a lot of people will get caught up, especially in the beginning, on submitting an offer, but they're worried about the fact that they haven't seen the property yet, and they're really worried about what they might find and that kind of thing. It's certainly, if the property is close to you, we will do that. So like if it's a deal in Charlotte or Charleston or Savannah or one of our local markets, we typically are going to tour that asset before the call for offers date, which is when they pull all the offers together. But if it's a deal, for example, in Houston, Texas, which is pretty much a $1,000 trip for us to get there and back, especially in this environment, you never know when you're going to be competitive. So those types of deals, we are not actually touring for the majority of the cases before we put an LOI in. But for deals that are local to our markets, or that within driving distance or a short flight, we typically are going to tour those assets. And that's a really important step in the process, where I typically like to review the broker OM, review our underwriting, and I just have an iPad that I take with me, and I write, notes about, what is, the situation with the bad debt, or, I know they spent CapEx on these amenities. Let's make sure we look at those and see if there's any additional CapEx to be spent. Or any kind of questions you might have about the area, about the market. I typically like to try to get to the property, about half an hour early. Try to drive some of the comps, try to drive the market, look at where the nearest grocery stores are, the retail areas, any new development going on, because we found in the past where CoStar and Yardi haven't picked up a new development happening, but then you drive a couple miles away from a property and there's a multifamily development coming in, which changes your supply and demand dynamics and your absorption and your demand for that property. So always important to try to get there early, try to drive around, try to come prepared with a couple questions that you might have, even if you just come with some questions, because it shows the broker that you're interested, that you're doing your due diligence, and you're not just showing up because you want to show the broker that you're out in the market. You want to, even if you're not really interested in the deal, at least kind of fake it, like ask intelligent questions, be interested, and have real feedback for that broker after the property tour. So you'll typically get to meet the property manager on site, and that's a really important process where I try to always ask them, if I handed you a blank check and you couldn't go to Vegas and you had to spend it on the property, what would you spend it on? And that they'll typically give you some answers where you kind of catch the broker kind of giving them a look where it's like, you're not supposed to say that, or whatever it might be. You typically get some interesting answers from that question, and some are better prepared than others, some managers. So it's always worth asking that question. And I think it's a pretty common one that they hear. I think other groups are asking that question as well. So that's a great question to ask during the property tour. After the property tour, the broker will typically take you outside, maybe out front of the clubhouse. There's where I typically will ask all questions related to pricing, timeline as far as call for offers date, interest in the property, any kind of information regarding the actual process or the transaction or the interest in the property. I'll try to get some answers out of the broker after the tour. Try to ask them any other questions that I might be able to think of on the property. Typically give them like high level feedback at this point, like, hey, the property shows really well, it's really clean, there might be some management upside here, and you can probably expect us to be offering on this deal next week or whenever the offers are due. Also, I'll typically try to ask for updated financial reports at this time, just in case the call for offers date is coming up, and we want to get updated debt quote, a soft debt quote, or an insurance quote, or we just want to plug a new rent roll into our model if it's a lease up deal and show the improved occupancy, whatever it might be. So that's an important step in that process on the property tour. After that property tour, we always get into a call with our property management company. And so that we use FCA management. Sorry, I missed a question there. Justin Jensen says, at what point do you start the underwriting process? So we are typically underwriting before the property tour. So if a deal gets sent out, if it's a blast on market deal, or if it's an off market deal, or if it's like a limited listing, we'll typically get an email or a phone call as the first communication point. And so high level, we vet it in terms of deal size, location, vintage, micro location within the submarket, kind of more of the qualitative aspects of the deal. So we'll try to underwrite it that way. And then if it fits all of our kind of criteria that way, we will then start the underwriting process, where typically the brokers will send us rent roll T12, we'll plug it into our model. We use Red IQ, which kind of automates some of that process since we're underwriting a lot of deals. And we'll go from there. So the underwriting process is kind of before this LOI, before the PSA, before the property tour. And that's how you come up with these intelligent questions, is by underwriting the deal, by maybe comparing your underwriting to the broker's underwriting, which is always a fun process. You know, don't trust a broker's underwriting is the joke behind that. So I hope that answers your question, Justin. There's not a slide deck that we can see. I'm just kind of talking through. I don't really have any documents that I'm reading off of. I'm just kind of talking through our process, what we typically see. And like I said, if there's any specific questions in that process, or as I'm talking through the property tour or the meeting with our management company or whatever it might be, feel free to just put those down in the Q&A or the chat, and we can kind of stop at that point in the process and then move forward from there. So we talked about the property tour. I was kind of getting into our management company. So we always have our management company sign off on our underwriting before we submit an offer. So what we actually do is we have them separately underwrite the deal, and then we underwrite the deal. So, and then we can kind of aggregate those two underwritings. And if it's a deal where we feel like we're close on, we'll typically have a call with them and be like, hey, we underwrote, the 780 square foot one bedrooms at 1,300, but you guys are at 1,275. What are some of the comps that we're both looking at? How do you guys feel about, the 1,300 or the 1,275? Is there a renovation plan that you guys were thinking of that we didn't think of? What are some other income, charges that they think we can get in this market that we aren't necessarily underwriting for? And it kind of ebbs and flows as far as who's more aggressive, who's more conservative. And so we kind of try to sometimes meet in the middle there. Sometimes there's an agreement as far as we're both looking at this the same way, and this is where we think rents will take. But we always try to have that conversation, because at the end of the day, your management company is who is going to be managing the property, and they're the ones that are going to be responsible for the day-to-day operations. Obviously, we have an asset management team that kind of holds them accountable to that, but you need to make sure that your property management company is signed off and committed to the results that you've underwritten for your investors. So we always get their sign off and their feedback on that. So that's an important step in the process. We always get a soft insurance quote as well, especially in this market. We try to understand, we always ask, have you binded a quote around this number for a similar asset recently? Because things have changed so much recently. So we always get, maybe even if it's 2 or 3 insurance quotes from a couple different brokers. That's just a really important part of the underwriting process. And I know this webinar is LOI and PSA, so I'm going to kind of transfer over into that. But if there are any other questions about the process leading up to these, like I said, just put them down in the chat box or Q&A, and we'll get into those. But now we're at the LOI. So typically, you want to have a good relationship with the broker, and the best way to do that is to underwrite the deals that come out, be in communication with them constantly, and get them good feedback on their deals. And if it's a deal that you like, follow up and submit an actual offer and intend to close with that offer. So I will typically call the broker before I send an LOI and just say, hey, appreciate all the engagement on this one. Maybe give some high level feedback, like, hey, our investment committee likes the deal. There's maybe some potential issues with the requirements that they had on site with the tenants. Like that's a recent deal example that's at the top of my mind. But give them some high level feedback, kind of tell them your high level interest in the property, and say, hey, we're coming in at $40 million. We're really comfortable at this number. We don't know how much room we have. Debt is, treasuries have risen 70 bips in the last month. So just kind of give them high level information. Here's our offer. I'll send it to you when we get off the phone. They always appreciate the heads up. It's always good to find good reasons to call a broker, because it's good news. Like, you're sending them an offer, You want to use that as a good time to give them a call, tell them, hey, good news, I'll be sending you an offer here shortly, blah, blah, blah. So you send the actual LOI, and that will typically have your timeline, your price, your general kind of high level terms. And there's all kinds of templates out there for LOIs. But typically we're at, general market terms or 30-day due diligence, 30 days to close. And there's sometimes an optional extension on the back end of that for additional earnest money. So maybe it's, $50,000 or $100,000 if you get to the end of the 60-day period and you want to extend another 30 days for debt reasons or whatever it may be. So that's a good kind of part of the process. You also want to make sure your earnest money terms are in there. So that's typically 1% of the purchase price at PSA execution and 1% of the purchase price at the end of due diligence. Is kind of the typical market terms there. Not necessarily that money is not necessarily hard. So typically your earnest money will go hard or non-refundable at the end of due diligence. So you typically have a 30-day or a 45-day period to once the contract gets signed to go on site on the property, get all the lease files, get all the financials, and make sure you're kind of looking through everything, bringing your management company into that as well, and just kind of going through the process that way. And then after that 30 or 45-day due diligence period, your money is typically non-refundable, contingent on a few like clean title, clean survey, clean environmental contingencies in there. In this environment, we're seeing more financing contingencies. Now, those aren't necessarily being accepted a lot of times by sellers, but it's certainly understandable to want to have some sort of financing contingency if the debt markets blow up again, or if interest rates, I've seen a table where if interest rates rise, for every 10 bips of interest rate movement upwards, our price goes down by X. So I've seen that. So you can get a little creative in this part of the process in the LOI. Again, this is just a letter of intent to execute at this offer. It is not, legally binding at this point, but it is important to be able to stand behind your LOI because the broker is not, or the seller is not going to want to work with you if you're the guy that, submits a great LOI and then you get to the PSA process and you're starting to change terms, even change price, which is definitely not good. So you just want to make sure you can stand behind what you're putting on an LOI in terms of executing. Typically, there's a couple revisions of the LOI that go back and forth. In a fully marketed process, you're probably going to get pushed on pricing a little bit in best and final. Sometimes even after best and final round, where they bring the top 3 to 5 groups in, you'll have a buyer interview call with the seller and the broker and just kind of give your background on your company and your experience and all this kind of stuff. Basically like a first date with the seller. If that goes well, sometimes they'll come back to you and ask for even more, like, hey, we want to go with you. We'll transact at 40.2 million and see if you can hit that number. I always typically prefer best and final actually meaning best and final. So like, this is your best and final offer, submit it the highest that you can be, and there will not be another chance to resubmit. As a buyer, I definitely prefer that because you're not getting squeezed more and more and more on different kinds of rounds. So you finally get an LOI accepted. You get the phone call, which is always a fun phone call from the broker that says, hey, the seller is looking to go with your group. You guys showed really well on the buyer interview call. Your terms are good, your price is good, let's get it done. Typically, we like to provide the first draft of the PSA. So this is loaded up already with the terms that we like, the kind of, again, this is based off the LOI. So nothing is truly changing in terms of the major terms of the offer from LOI to PSA. But there's a lot of things in the PSA, like, like a rent ready credit, for example. So if a unit isn't rent ready, you get a certain amount of money typically for that at closing. And the goal obviously being that all units are rent ready, but ours is loaded in there already in our template with a fairly high dollar amount to start the negotiation. And typically there's some kind of negotiation that takes place and you meet somewhere in the middle. So that's kind of like why we like to provide the first draft of the PSA. We always emphasize speed in this part of the process. So we are typically getting a first draft of a PSA out like within that day or maybe the next day, but we have our draft PSAs ready to go. We have our in-house counsel, Lenore, who's fantastic. So she's ready to rip, whenever we are, and we typically get that out extremely quick. We also do revisions very quickly. So it's typically 24 hours, if that, turnaround period for us to be able to receive revisions from a seller, review them, come up with our revisions, and send it back. A lot of people shoot for 48 hours. We're typically 24 hours, if not quicker. As soon as a PSA revision hits my inbox, I'm forwarding it to Lenore, I'm reviewing it on my computer, and I'm giving her my feedback, and then she'll typically call me with her feedback. We'll come to an agreement, and we shoot it off to the seller. So that we've gotten many compliments on that part of the process for our group. It's super important to be fast and accurate in the PSA process, because there's a lot of trepidation from a seller as well, because they just chose you. You want to make a good first impression. You want to make sure you're being speedy and expediting the transaction is typically in the interest of everyone. So let's see, that's the PSA. So also in this PSA process, and again, we are leaning on the expertise a lot of times of third parties in this process. So this may sound like, a lot. You have to do this whole due diligence process after this PSA is signed, this whole LOI stuff. Like, it's important to have third parties that you really trust. So for us, it's in-house counsel. For you, it may be, and Lenore actually started as a third party outside counsel for us, and we actually brought her in-house because she was so good. But finding that counsel that you really trust and that works quickly with you is really important, and that certainly helps a ton in this LOI and PSA process, where there's a lot of parts moving, there's a lot of things going on, and you want to make sure you're staying up to date with everything going on. I'm trying to think what else to talk about in the PSA process. There's a lot of back and forth on little terms. A good way to review when a PSA comes back to you is look for the dollar signs. So typically that is a lot of the thing that is changing, and it's not the price necessarily or the earnest money, because that's typically agreed upon in the LOI, but it's, like I said, rent ready credit. It's dates of certain contingencies. It's dates relating to how many days they have to get you all the financial information for due diligence. It's a lot of numbers and dollar amounts and things that you can kind of skim through and really try to focus on. And you get better each transaction, you learn something, and it's just a good way to get better at helping transactions to actually go through. Feel free to put down questions. I can move into kind of what starts to happen in due diligence. We're coming up on a half-hour mark, so I'll probably talk for another a couple minutes and then open it up for questions. But just want to make sure that you all are getting your questions answered and trying to better understand what actually happens in the LOI and PSA process. So feel free to ask questions as you think of them. After this kind of PSA negotiation goes back and forth, that will typically take for us, depending on the seller's speed, maybe a week and a half, up to 2 weeks, depending on some of the sticking points that we may have. It's gone as quick as 4 or 5 days before. Here we go. Here, a question. What are your typical due diligence items in your PSA? It's pretty standard, so I don't know if I have one up here, but if you search, a multifamily PSA template, it's typically, financials for the past couple of years, all the vendor information, like what kind of trash and everything, all the vendor contracts that they have. You'll have to pick which ones you want to keep on the property, which ones you want to terminate, any cable contracts that they might have, that kind of thing. But ours are very boilerplate. We don't ask for anything that I would say is strange. We get like bank account information to make sure that they're actually making the money that they say they're making. So like bank deposits and things like that. But ours are very, very standard, and we try to not ask for anything that we don't actually need as well, but also ask for everything that we do need or that our lender might need, and all that kind of thing. So I hope that helps. Ram says, any suggestions for first-time syndicators in the LOI and PSA process? Yeah, I think what we were talking about earlier with making sure that you're finding third parties that you really trust. And so that is true for property management companies. That's true for legal counsel, insurance brokers, the list goes on, lenders, debt brokers. So this whole kind of process is fairly reliant on third parties. And so you need to make sure that all the third parties that you're working with are doing what they need to be doing. We will typically, this is a helpful tip, anytime a PSA is signed for us, we will make a one-page document that has all the important dates of the contract, what is due that date, or what needs to happen by that date, with an assigned person that's responsible for that happening. So now we've gotten to a point where we've brought on a transaction coordinator. Her name's Jessica, and she does a great job making sure that's all organized and everything like that. But we back in the years that the market was so active and we were doing $400 million a year, we didn't actually have that person at that time. So it was a lot of just making sure you're on top of it. I like to try to get up, especially when you're under contract on a deal, try to get up early before the emails and the day starts rolling at you, and people start asking you for things and everything starts happening. Try to plan out maybe even just a half hour to just do a transaction checkup and just make sure that everything on that transaction is where it should be. Review the dates again, make sure you're on top of those, see if there's anything you need from the broker, and just kind of remaining in constant contact with that broker. But it's really not as it's not as intimidating as it seems. Sending an offer is a scary part of the process, especially when it's your first offer, your first couple offers, because you do have to do your best to stand behind that. But as soon as you get the first couple out, it becomes a little less intimidating, and you start familiarizing yourself with the terminology in the LOI. I always read through the entirety of our LOI and the entirety of the PSA before we sign anything. Danny does as well. So it's just really important to understand those documents, have good third-party relationships with counsel, with property management companies, and that kind of thing. So hope that helps, Ram, with your question there. We have a question here. How many days option period is negotiated? How do you do your due diligence to stay in the soft period? How many days option period is negotiated? I think you're talking about the extension option after due diligence and after closing. So when you're talking about the beginning, typically a 30 or 45 day due diligence, a 30 or 45 day closing, and then the 30-day, which we usually put in a 30-day extension period. Typically we'll ask for 30 days. We'll typically get it because we're putting down more earnest money at that point to extend the deal. So this is typically for any lender issues, or pretty much lender issues is all we've ever had to use it for. But if you have trouble raising equity, that can be helpful. But we always try to put that in there in case of anything out of our control happens with the lending situation. And it's proved helpful, especially in these last 18 months or so. So I hope that answers your question. Feel free to follow up if that's not what you meant by option period. And then how do you do your due diligence to stay in the soft period? So yeah, this soft period, I think is what he's talking about is the first 30 or 45 days of the transaction after you sign that PSA, and after it's fully executed, you have that 30 or 45 days of due diligence with no hard money down. Typically, sometimes you'll put hard money down if it's a competitive bidding environment and you feel really good about the deal. But assuming this is a standard transaction with no hard money, you will have to do all of your due diligence in this period. So we'll typically send out an email, a kickoff email is what we call it, right around the time that the PSA is executed, where we say, as a reminder, here are all the due diligence documents. I know there's a question earlier about that. Here are all the due diligence documents that we need to be provided per the PSA. You have 3 days per the contract to provide these. We can set up a Dropbox, or sometimes the brokerage company will set up a Dropbox, and the seller will start loading their documents inside of that Dropbox. We'll go in every day and just do a quick checklist items, make sure we have everything that we need, and really push hard to get these as soon as possible, because that helps your lenders and your third parties and your internal analysis to make sure that everything is lining up. Also in this kickoff email, we're proposing some days and some times that our team is going to be able to go down and actually do on-site due diligence. So we'll say, hey, any day, Wednesday or Thursday of next week from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. we'll be on site for the entirety of those 2 days. Please let us know if this works with the seller. We plan on, walking all units, reviewing all lease files. Let us know if the lease files are electronic or if they're paper. If they're paper, we have to actually, we as in our property management company most times has to go through all those leases on site. If they're electronic, they don't necessarily have to be on site. Sometimes they'll come down anyway to review those leases on computers in the conference room or whatever. But yeah, so we'll propose some times. We'll get down there as soon as we can, and basically just do our on-site due diligence and bring our asset manager down, Brian, who has a ton of experience in the construction and renovation type of world. Our acquisition team and myself will typically go down and meet with the broker, take the broker out to dinner, make it a nice trip for them. And typically the broker will be there. Sometimes they're not, but they'll kind of stop in and make sure everything's going well. So that's a good part of that process in that kind of 30 or 45 day due diligence period, to make sure that you're getting done, as well as trying to get to trying to make sure that you're seeing everything that you need to be seeing, and following up with your lenders, make sure their soft quotes are still good. Your insurance broker, make sure they're doing what they should be doing, scheduling your lender inspections, your third parties. So all this kind of stuff happens during that due diligence period. Andres said, is 50 unit a small size deal to start with? No, I wouldn't say a 50 unit is too small. My first deal was a 12 unit that I did west of Charlotte here. So certainly not too small. It's actually maybe a good thing to start smaller with your own capital and not others people's capital sometimes, to make mistakes on your own dime and do things the right way and figure out how to do a deal and start from there. So 50 units is definitely not too small. There's a lot of people that make a lot of money doing the smaller stuff because you're typically working with more of a mom and pop type seller. You're competing against less institutions. So there's more of a sometimes more upside with those smaller types of deals. So hope that answers that question. We're about 40 minutes in. So if there's any other questions, I'll give it maybe a minute or two. I hope this was helpful talking about the LOI PSA process. We got into underwriting, we got into due diligence. So always happy and an open book to try to help out and clear up some of this stuff, because I know there's a lot of steps in the process. Someone says, anyone who loves 911s like I do is my kind of guy. There you go. Yep, right behind me there. That's funny. Paul says, do you guys sponsor? That would be a question for our investor relations team. We're typically always the main sponsor. So we don't co-GP with other groups with other groups' deals. So we are the main sponsor with all of our syndications. We're the people, signing on the debt and operating the deal and analyzing the deal and all that kind of stuff. Well, cool. I don't see any other questions coming in. Thank you all for joining. As always, I'm available for any specific questions. My email is Eric, it's ERIC @passiveinvesting.com. And yeah, thank you all for joining. Thanks for asking questions and being engaged. I hope you all have a great Tuesday and a great rest of your week. Thank you.